The silence was wrong. In a palace where even whispers carried weight, where every footstep echoed with purpose, the sudden absence of sound sent chills down the spine of every guard on duty. Prince William had been behind those ornate doors for 3 hours. 3 hours without a single word, movement, or response to increasingly urgent knocks. What started as a routine morning briefing had transformed into a nightmare scenario that would test the very foundations of royal protocol. The head of security's walkie-talkie crackled with tension as he made the call that would change everything. "Your Royal Highness, we need you to step back. We're coming in." The heavy oak doors, carved with centuries of royal history, were about to be breached. But what lay beyond them would shake the monarchy to its core and reveal a truth so shocking that it would remain classified for years to come. This is the untold story of the day Prince William discovered that being heir to the throne meant more than just ceremony and duty. Sometimes it meant making decisions that could save or destroy everything he was born to protect. The morning of October 15th began like any other at Kensington Palace, with a gentle hum of activity that accompanies the daily routine of the British royal family. Prince William had risen early, as was his custom, and completed his morning run through Hyde Park before the city fully awakened. The autumn air was crisp, carrying with it the scent of falling leaves and the promise of another day filled with royal duties and obligations. Catherine had left earlier for a charity event in Manchester, taking the children with her for what was meant to be a family visit to a children's hospital. The palace felt unusually quiet without the sound of George, Charlotte, and Louis racing through the corridors, their laughter usually echoing off the historic walls. William found himself appreciating these rare moments of solitude, when he could think clearly about the weight of his future responsibilities. At precisely 9:30 a.m., William entered his private study for what his daily schedule listed as a confidential briefing. The room, decorated with family portraits and official documents, had witnessed countless important conversations over the years. Today's meeting was arranged by Sir Clive Alderton, the principal private secretary to the king, who had requested an urgent discussion about matters of national security. The study's heavy wooden doors closed behind them with a soft thud that seemed to separate the room from the rest of the world. Sir Clive, a man known for his composed demeanor and careful choice of words, appeared unusually tense. His normally immaculate appearance showed signs of stress. His tie was slightly askew, and there were dark circles under his eyes that suggested a sleepless night. "Your Royal Highness," Sir Clive began, his voice carrying an unusual gravity, "what I'm about to share with you cannot leave this room. It concerns intelligence that has come to our attention regarding a potential threat to the monarchy itself." William straightened in his chair, his military training immediately focusing his attention. He had served in the Royal Air Force and understood the seriousness of national security matters, but the urgency in Sir Clive's voice suggested something far beyond the typical security concerns that surrounded the royal family. The briefing documents that Sir Clive spread across the mahogany desk were marked with the highest classification levels. As William began to read, his expression grew increasingly grave. The papers detailed a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government, involving foreign intelligence services and individuals within the British establishment who had been working for years to undermine the constitutional monarchy. The plot was sophisticated and far-reaching. According to the intelligence reports, certain members of Parliament, working in conjunction with foreign operatives, had been systematically gathering information about the royal family's private communications, financial dealings, and personal relationships. Their goal was not merely political embarrassment, but the complete dismantling of the monarchical system through a carefully orchestrated series of scandals and revelations. What made the situation even more alarming was the discovery that someone within the royal household itself was providing information to the conspirators. The security services had identified unusual patterns in communication intercepts and financial transactions that pointed to a highly placed source with access to the most sensitive royal information. As William absorbed the implications of what he was reading, Sir Clive continued to explain the immediate dangers. The intelligence suggests they plan to execute their final phase within the next 48 hours, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. They have evidence they believe will be devastating to your father's reign and your own future succession. The evidence in question involved doctored financial documents that purported to show illegal offshore accounts, fabricated communications suggesting inappropriate political interference, and manipulated photographs that could be used to create scandals involving various members of the royal family. The sophistication of the forgeries was such that they would likely fool initial media scrutiny and create a crisis of confidence before their false nature could be established. William felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. The decisions made in the next few hours would determine not just his own future, but the future of an institution that had guided Britain for over 1,000 years. The monarchy had survived wars, scandals, and constitutional crises, but this threat was different. It was designed specifically to exploit the modern media landscape and the public's growing skepticism about traditional institutions. Sir Clive explained that the security services had developed a plan to neutralize the threat, but it required actions that pushed the boundaries of what was legally and constitutionally permissible. The plan involved coordinated raids on multiple locations, the detention of suspects without formal charges while evidence was secured, and the use of emergency powers that had not been invoked since the Second World War. The Prime Minister is aware of the situation, Sir Clive continued, but the decision ultimately rests with your father. However, given the King's current health concerns and the need for immediate action, you may need to act on his behalf. The reference to his father's health added another layer of complexity to an already impossible situation. King Charles had been dealing with health issues that were not publicly known, and the stress of this crisis could potentially exacerbate his condition. The thought of his father facing this additional burden during what should have been a peaceful period of his reign troubled William deeply. As the briefing continued, William learned that the conspiracy had international dimensions. Intelligence agencies from friendly nations had been sharing information about suspicious activities in their own countries that appeared connected to the plot against the British monarchy. The web of intrigue stretched from London to Washington, from Moscow to Beijing, suggesting that the threat was part of a larger effort to destabilize Western democratic institutions. The psychological pressure of processing this information began to take its toll on William. He found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about the people around him, wondering who could be trusted and who might be working against his family. The paranoia that comes with such revelations started to cloud his judgment, making every conversation and interaction seem potentially dangerous. Sir Clive noticed William's growing distress and attempted to provide reassurance. Your Royal Highness, I understand this is overwhelming, but you must know that we have some of the finest intelligence officers in the world working on this matter. The situation is serious, but it is not hopeless. The conversation continued for hours, with Sir Clive providing additional details about the investigation and the proposed response. They discussed contingency plans for various scenarios, including the possibility that the conspiracy was even more extensive than initially believed. William found himself being briefed on emergency protocols that he had hoped never to need, procedures for maintaining royal authority during a constitutional crisis. As the morning turned into afternoon, the weight of secrecy began to press down on William. He thought about Catherine and the children, wondering how this crisis might affect their lives and safety. The idea that forces were working to destroy everything his family represented filled him with a combination of anger and determination. He would not allow a conspiracy to succeed where Hitler's bombs and centuries of political upheaval had failed. The briefing materials included psychological profiles of the suspected conspirators, financial analysis of their activities, and technical details about the sophisticated disinformation campaign they had been preparing. The level of planning and resources involved suggested state-level backing, confirming William's worst fears about the international dimensions of the threat. By the time Sir Clive finished presenting all the evidence and proposed responses, William understood that he was facing the most significant challenge of his life. The decisions he made in the coming hours would echo through history, potentially determining whether the monarchy survived into the next generation. The young prince who had once struggled with the normal challenges of royal life now found himself at the center of a crisis that would test every aspect of his character and judgment. The silence that followed the end of the briefing was profound. William sat in his chair, staring at the documents spread before him, trying to process the magnitude of what he had learned. Outside the windows of his study, life in London continued normally, with people going about their daily routines unaware that the very foundations of their constitutional system were under attack. The contrast between the normalcy beyond the palace walls and the crisis within them seemed almost surreal. Sir Clive gathered the classified documents and secured them in a specially designed briefcase, but he made no move to leave. He understood that William needed time to absorb what he had learned and to consider the options available to him. The next phase of their response would require careful coordination with multiple government agencies and international partners, but first, the future king needed to find his resolve. William rose from his chair and walked to the window, looking out at the gardens where he had played as a child. The weight of history seemed to press down on him as he contemplated the generations of royals who had faced their own crises and challenges. He drew strength from their example, remembering that the monarchy had survived because each generation had found the courage to do what was necessary to protect the institution and serve the nation. After Sir Clive's departure, Prince William remained alone in his study, the classified briefing materials secured, but their implications burning in his mind like acid. The afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the Persian carpets and antique furniture that had witnessed centuries of royal decisions. For the first time in his adult life, William felt truly isolated, carrying knowledge so dangerous that sharing it with anyone unauthorized could itself become a threat to national security. The prince attempted to maintain his normal routine, but every interaction felt different now. When his private secretary knocked to remind him of an upcoming engagement with a veterans organization, William found himself studying the man's face for any sign of deception or unusual behavior. The paranoia that comes with knowledge of betrayal at the highest levels began to seep into every aspect of his thinking. He canceled the veterans event, citing a sudden illness, a decision that immediately triggered concern among his staff. Prince William was known for his dedication to duty and rarely canceled appointments without significant reason. His private secretary, James Morrison, a loyal man who had served the royal family for over 15 years, knocked again 20 minutes later to express his concern and offer assistance. "I'm quite all right, James," William called through the door, his voice strained despite his efforts to sound normal. "I simply need some time alone to work through some urgent matters. Please ensure I'm not disturbed for the remainder of the day." The instruction was unusual enough to set off quiet alarm bells throughout the palace staff. In an institution where every moment was typically scheduled and accounted for, the prince's sudden withdrawal from all activities was unprecedented. Word spread quietly among the household staff that something significant was troubling their future king. Inside the study, William paced restlessly, his mind racing through the implications of what he had learned. The conspiracy outlined in Sir Clive's briefing was not just an attack on his family. It was an assault on the very concept of constitutional monarchy and the delicate balance of power that had evolved over centuries. The psychological weight of this responsibility began to manifest in physical symptoms. His hands shook slightly as he poured himself a glass of water, and he found it difficult to concentrate on anything other than the crisis at hand. The prince attempted to call his father to discuss the situation, but King Charles was in Scotland for a private engagement and was reportedly not taking calls due to his own health concerns. This isolation from his primary source of guidance and support added another layer of stress to an already overwhelming situation. William realized that, for perhaps the first time in his life, he would need to make decisions of historic importance without the benefit of his father's counsel. As the afternoon wore on, William's behavior became increasingly erratic. He would sit for long periods staring at a single point on the wall, lost in thought about the ramifications of the conspiracy. Then he would suddenly jump up and pace the room frantically, as if physical movement could somehow help him process the mental chaos he was experiencing. The weight of knowing that foreign adversaries and domestic traitors were actively working to destroy his family's legacy created a level of stress that his previous royal training had not prepared him for. The security implications of the briefing also meant that William could not use his normal communication channels. His personal phones, email accounts, and even his face-to-face conversations might be monitored by hostile intelligence services. This communication blackout increased his sense of isolation and made it impossible for him to seek guidance from trusted advisors outside the immediate circle of those already briefed on the conspiracy. James Morrison made several more attempts to check on the prince as the afternoon progressed. Each time, William's responses became shorter and more distant. The private secretary, trained to recognize signs of distress in the royal family, began to worry that something more serious than a simple illness was affecting the prince. The tone of William's voice through the door suggested a level of emotional strain that Morrison had never heard before. By early evening, William's internal struggle had reached a critical point. The competing demands of protecting national security, preserving the monarchy, and maintaining his own psychological stability were creating an impossible tension. He found himself questioning fundamental assumptions about trust, loyalty, and the nature of power itself. The young man who had entered the study that morning confident in his understanding of his role and responsibilities was being transformed by knowledge that challenged everything he thought he knew about the world around him. The prince attempted to eat dinner, but found that the food was tasteless and difficult to swallow. His appetite had completely disappeared, replaced by a constant knot of anxiety in his stomach. Even simple acts like drinking water required conscious effort, as his mind remained fixed on the conspiracy and its potential consequences for his family and the nation. As darkness fell over London, William's study became a cocoon of isolation within the bustling palace. The normal evening activities of the royal household continued around him, but he remained disconnected from all of it, trapped in a psychological prison created by the weight of dangerous knowledge. The contrast between the normalcy outside his door and the crisis consuming his thoughts created a surreal sense of disconnection from reality. The prince tried to distract himself by reading, but the words on the page seemed meaningless compared to the classified documents he had reviewed earlier. Every book, newspaper, and magazine seemed trivial in the face of the existential threat to the monarchy that he now knew existed. His normal interests and pleasures had been stripped away by the gravity of the situation he was facing. William's thoughts turned repeatedly to Catherine and the children. Were they safe in Manchester? Could the conspirators have extended their reach to threaten his family directly? The briefing had mentioned that the plotters had detailed information about royal family movements and security arrangements, suggesting that nowhere might truly be safe from their influence. These concerns about his family's safety added another dimension to his growing anxiety. The psychological isolation created by the security restrictions began to take a more severe toll as the evening progressed. William found himself talking aloud to empty air, rehearsing conversations he couldn't have and arguments he couldn't make. The need to maintain absolute secrecy meant that even this verbal processing had to be done carefully in case sophisticated listening devices had been planted in his private quarters. Around 10 o'clock, William made another attempt to contact his father, but was told that the king was in conference with advisors and could not be disturbed. This second rejection of his request for guidance pushed William deeper into his psychological spiral. The man who would one day be king felt completely alone with knowledge that could destroy the institution he was born to protect. The prince's behavior during these critical hours was later described by palace sources as the most concerning they had ever witnessed. Staff members who occasionally glimpsed him through windows reported that he appeared to be in a state of extreme agitation, pacing constantly and occasionally stopping to stare intensely at objects around the room as if they held some hidden significance. As the night deepened, William's isolation became more complete. The palace gradually quieted as staff finished their duties and retired for the evening, leaving the prince alone with his thoughts and fears. The silence that had initially been a refuge from the outside world now became oppressive, amplifying every sound and making the enormity of his situation feel even more overwhelming. The psychological pressure began manifesting in physical symptoms that William had never experienced before. His heart rate remained elevated for hours, his hands developed a persistent tremor, and he found it impossible to sit still for more than a few minutes at a time. The combination of stress, isolation, and the weight of responsibility was creating a perfect storm of psychological distress. William attempted to sleep around midnight, but found it impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, his mind raced through scenarios of political collapse, family disgrace, and constitutional crisis. The detailed planning revealed in the conspiracy documents suggested that the plotters had anticipated multiple contingencies and had responses prepared for various royal reactions. This realization that his enemies had war-gamed his likely responses added another layer of psychological pressure. The prince began to question his own judgment and capabilities. Was he strong enough to handle this crisis? Did he have the political acumen necessary to navigate such a complex threat? The self-doubt that had occasionally troubled him during his younger years returned with devastating force, amplified by the magnitude of the decisions he would soon need to make. By the early morning hours, William's condition had deteriorated significantly. The combination of no sleep, no food, and constant psychological stress had pushed him to the edge of his mental and physical endurance. He continued to pace his study like a caged animal, unable to find peace or resolution in the isolation that had initially seemed necessary for processing the crisis. The palace security staff, trained to monitor potential threats from outside, had not initially recognized the psychological threat developing within the prince's own quarters. It would not be until the morning shift arrived and noticed the unusual circumstances that alarm bells would begin ringing throughout the royal protection apparatus. The morning of October 16th brought no relief to Prince William's deteriorating psychological state. He had not slept, eaten properly, or spoken to anyone outside his study for nearly 18 hours. The classified briefing that had begun as urgent information had transformed into a psychological prison from which he seemed unable to escape. His mind, trained for duty and service, had become trapped in an endless loop of analysis, fear, and isolation that was consuming his ability to function. Chief Inspector Daniel Hayes, the senior protection officer on duty, arrived at the palace at 6 a.m. for his shift briefing. Hayes, a 15-year veteran of royal protection with experience in counterterrorism and threat assessment, immediately noticed irregularities in the previous day's reports. The prince's canceled appointments, his refusal to take calls, and his complete withdrawal from normal activities created a pattern that triggered professional concern. The protection protocols for the royal family were designed primarily to address external threats, terrorists, assassins, or hostile foreign agents. However, Hayes recognized that isolation and extreme stress could create internal security risks that were equally dangerous. A member of the royal family in psychological distress could make decisions that compromise their own safety or national security interests. The classified nature of whatever William was dealing with made assessment and intervention particularly challenging. Hayes consulted with the palace's senior staff, including the private secretary's office and the master of the household. Their reports confirmed his growing concerns. James Morrison, William's private secretary, described the prince's voice as increasingly strained and disconnected during their brief conversations through the study door. The household staff reported that no food had been taken from the prince's quarters since the previous morning, and unusual sounds, pacing, occasional voices, and what sounded like furniture being moved had been heard throughout the night. The challenge facing the palace staff was unprecedented. Royal protocol demanded absolute respect for the privacy and autonomy of senior family members, but duty of care required intervention when someone's safety might be at risk. The balance between these competing obligations was made more complex by the unknown nature of whatever crisis William was facing. Without understanding the cause of his distress, it was impossible to determine the appropriate response. Hayes made the decision to conduct a discreet security assessment of the prince's quarters. Using sophisticated listening equipment designed for counter-surveillance operations, his team was able to determine that William was alone and appeared to be physically uninjured. However, the audio surveillance revealed concerning patterns of behavior, long periods of rapid movement around the room, extended monologues that suggested extreme agitation, and occasional sounds that might indicate objects being thrown or furniture being damaged. The security team faced an additional complication in the form of strict compartmentalization of information. Hayes and his officers had security clearances that allowed them to know about general threats to the royal family, but they were not briefed on the specific conspiracy that had triggered William's crisis. This information gap made it extremely difficult to assess whether the prince's behavior was a reasonable response to a genuine threat or an indication that he was having some form of psychological breakdown. By mid-morning, the situation had attracted attention from other senior palace officials. Sir Clive Alderton, who had conducted the original briefing with William, was contacted at his London residence and asked to return to the palace immediately. His knowledge of the prince's state of mind and the classified information he possessed made him the only person qualified to assess the developing situation. Sir Clive's return to the palace at 10:30 a.m. marked the beginning of a more coordinated response to the crisis. He immediately understood that William's prolonged isolation and silence indicated that the psychological impact of the conspiracy briefing had been more severe than anticipated. The weight of discovering that trusted institutions and individuals might be working to destroy his family had clearly overwhelmed the prince's ability to process and respond normally. The principal private secretary attempted to contact William through the study door, identifying himself and requesting a brief conversation to assess the prince's condition. The response he received was deeply concerning. William's voice, when he finally answered, was hoarse and strained, suggesting exhaustion and dehydration. His words were disjointed and difficult to follow, indicating that his mental state had deteriorated significantly since their conversation the previous day. "Your Royal Highness," Sir Clive said through the heavy oak door, "I understand you're processing difficult information, but we need to ensure your well-being. Can you please open the door so we can speak properly?" William's response was fragmented and concerning. "How do I know? How can anyone be trusted? They could be listening. They could be anyone. Everything might be compromised. How do I know you're really who you say you are?" This response revealed that William had developed what psychologists term acute paranoid ideation, a temporary but severe condition where an individual's ability to assess reality becomes compromised by overwhelming stress and fear. The conspiracy he had learned about, combined with his isolation and lack of sleep, had created a psychological state where he could no longer distinguish between legitimate caution and irrational suspicion. Sir Clive immediately recognized the seriousness of the situation. He had seen similar reactions in intelligence operatives who had been exposed to information about deep-cover conspiracies or long-term infiltration operations. The psychological impact of discovering that one's fundamental assumptions about trust and security are false can be devastating, particularly for individuals who have been raised to believe in institutional stability and personal loyalty. The palace's medical staff was quietly contacted, including Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the royal family's personal physician who specialized in stress-related conditions. Dr. Mitchell had security clearance that allowed her to be briefed on sensitive situations affecting family members' health. Her assessment, based on the behavioral report she received, was that William was experiencing an acute stress reaction that could potentially escalate into more serious psychological complications if not addressed promptly. The medical implications of William's condition added urgency to the developing crisis. Prolonged stress, sleep deprivation, and dehydration could lead to physical health problems that might require medical intervention. More concerning was the possibility that his compromised mental state could lead him to make decisions that might endanger his own safety or compromise national security. The classified information in his possession made his psychological stability a matter of state concern. Chief Inspector Hayes coordinated with his team to develop contingency plans for various scenarios. If William's condition continued to deteriorate, they might need to force entry into the study to ensure his physical safety. However, such action would violate every principle of royal protocol and could potentially create a scandal that would damage the monarchy's reputation. The decision to breach a senior royal's privacy required authorization from the highest levels of government and palace administration. The psychological assessment provided by Dr. Mitchell suggested that William's condition was likely temporary, but potentially dangerous in the short term. Acute stress reactions could cause individuals to act irrationally or make decisions based on distorted perceptions of reality. Given William's future role as king and his current access to sensitive information, his impaired judgment could have serious consequences beyond his personal well-being. As the morning progressed, additional signs of William's deteriorating condition became apparent. Palace staff reported hearing what sounded like sobbing coming from the study, interspersed with angry outbursts and periods of complete silence. The emotional volatility suggested that the prince was cycling through different phases of psychological distress, unable to find stability or peace of mind. The security team's surveillance equipment also detected that William had not consumed any food or water for over 20 hours. The combination of stress and dehydration was likely contributing to his confused mental state and could soon create serious physical health risks. Dr. Mitchell advised that intervention might become medically necessary within the next few hours if the prince's condition did not improve. Sir Clive made the difficult decision to attempt more direct communication with William. He positioned himself directly outside the study door and began speaking in a calm, authoritative voice about the specific classified information they had discussed the previous day. His goal was to demonstrate that he was indeed who he claimed to be and to provide some psychological anchor for William's increasingly fragmented thinking. Your Royal Highness, yesterday we discussed Operation Blackwater and the intelligence regarding domestic infiltration. I showed you the financial analysis prepared by Section D and the communication intercepts from the NSA Liaison Office. You expressed particular concern about the implications for your father's health and the timing of the proposed response. These are details that only we discussed, which should confirm my identity. This approach appeared to have some positive effect. William's voice, when he responded, was slightly more coherent. Yes, I remember. But how do I know they haven't gotten to you too? How do I know this isn't part of their plan? Maybe they told you to say these things to get me to open the door. The response indicated that while William's memory and reasoning abilities were still functioning, his ability to assess risk and trust had been severely compromised by the psychological impact of the conspiracy revelation. The paranoid thinking that had developed was now self-reinforcing, creating elaborate scenarios that justified continued isolation and mistrust. Dr. Mitchell, listening to these exchanges, advised the palace leadership that William's condition was following a predictable pattern for acute stress reactions in high-responsibility individuals. The combination of his royal upbringing, which emphasized duty and institutional loyalty, with the discovery that these very institutions might be compromised, had created a cognitive dissonance that his mind was struggling to resolve. The morning's attempts at communication had revealed the complexity of the psychological crisis developing within William's study. He was trapped between his duty to process and respond to the classified information he had received and his inability to trust the very systems and people who were supposed to help him navigate the crisis. This psychological paralysis was preventing him from taking any action, which in itself was becoming dangerous as time passed, and decisions needed to be made about the conspiracy he had learned about. By noon on October 16th, the situation inside Prince William's study had reached a critical juncture that demanded immediate action from palace officials. The combination of his deteriorating psychological state, the time-sensitive nature of the classified intelligence he possessed, and the potential security implications of his condition had created a crisis that transcended normal royal protocol. Chief Inspector Hayes, in consultation with Sir Clive Alderton and Dr. Mitchell, made the unprecedented decision to prepare for forced entry into the prince's private quarters. The decision was not made lightly. In over 1,000 years of monarchical history, there were virtually no precedents for forcibly breaching a senior royal's privacy against their will. The legal and constitutional implications were staggering, potentially involving questions of royal prerogative, personal liberty, and the balance of power between the monarchy and state security services. However, the duty of care owed to William, combined with national security concerns, ultimately outweighed these traditional considerations. Sir Clive contacted Number 10, Downing Street, to brief the Prime Minister's office on the developing situation. The conversation was conducted using the most secure communication channels available to ensure that sensitive information about both the prince's condition and the underlying conspiracy remained protected. The Prime Minister's principal private secretary received a carefully worded briefing that conveyed the urgency of the situation without compromising operational security. The response from Downing Street was swift and decisive. The Prime Minister, recognizing that the situation involved both a member of the royal family and sensitive national security matters, authorized the palace security team to take whatever actions are necessary to ensure Prince William's safety and security. This authorization provided the legal framework needed for the unprecedented breach of royal privacy that was being contemplated. Dr. Mitchell played a crucial role in developing the intervention plan. Her medical assessment indicated that William was likely suffering from acute stress-induced psychosis, a temporary but serious condition that could cause him to perceive threats that did not exist or to misinterpret the intentions of people trying to help him. This psychological state meant that a forced entry might trigger an aggressive or self-destructive response that could endanger both William and the intervention team. The medical protocol developed by Dr. Mitchell involved a carefully orchestrated approach designed to minimize psychological trauma while ensuring William's physical safety. The entry team would include herself and a psychiatric specialist familiar with stress-related disorders and high-profile individuals. Their presence would allow for immediate assessment and treatment of any psychological or physical health issues that might be discovered. Chief Inspector Hayes assembled a specialized team for the intervention, drawing from officers with experience in hostage negotiations, psychiatric emergencies, and VIP protection. Each team member was briefed on William's likely psychological state and the need to approach him with extreme care and sensitivity. The goal was not just to gain entry to the study, but to do so in a way that would allow for William's psychological recovery and maintain the dignity appropriate to his royal status. The technical aspects of the planned entry required careful consideration of the study's construction and security features. The heavy oak doors were not just decorative. They had been reinforced as part of security upgrades implemented after various terrorist threats over the years. The entry team would need to use specialized equipment to breach the doors without causing excessive damage or creating loud noises that might further traumatize William. As preparations for the intervention continued, palace staff worked to maintain normal operations while dealing with the unprecedented crisis in their midst. The challenge of keeping William's condition secret while preparing for a forced entry required careful coordination and absolute discretion from everyone involved. Any leak of information about the prince's psychological state could create a media storm that would damage both his personal reputation and the monarchy's public standing. Sir Clive made one final attempt to reach William through verbal communication before authorizing the physical intervention. Standing outside the study door, he spoke with the calm authority that had served him throughout his career in diplomatic and intelligence work. His words were carefully chosen to penetrate whatever psychological barriers William had constructed while avoiding any language that might be perceived as threatening or manipulative. Your Royal Highness, I need you to listen to me very carefully. You have been alone for over 24 hours, and we are concerned for your health and safety. The information we discussed yesterday was indeed serious, but it is being handled by the appropriate authorities. You are not alone in dealing with this crisis, and you do not need to carry this burden by yourself. We need you to open the door so that we can provide the support and assistance you need. The response from within the study was immediate and alarming. William's voice, now barely recognizable due to hoarseness and emotional strain, carried a level of distress that shocked even the experienced officials listening outside. You don't understand. If I open that door, everything changes. Everything we've worked for, everything my family has built, could be destroyed. They're watching everything. They know everything. How can I trust anyone when the very foundations of what we believe in have been corrupted? This response confirmed Dr. Mitchell's assessment that William's psychological condition had progressed beyond simple stress and anxiety into a more serious dissociative state. His perception of reality had become so distorted by the conspiracy information and his prolonged isolation that he was unable to distinguish between genuine threats and his own psychological projections. The paranoid ideation that had begun the previous day had now become a complete psychological framework that governed his thinking and behavior. The medical team standing by for the intervention included specialists in emergency psychiatry who had experience with similar cases involving high-stress government and military personnel. Their assessment, based on the behavioral reports and audio samples, was that William was experiencing what psychologists term acute paranoid psychosis with persecution ideation. This condition, while temporary and treatable, could be extremely dangerous if left unaddressed. Chief Inspector Hayes gave the final authorization for the intervention at 2:15 p.m., exactly 29 hours after William had entered his study for the classified briefing. The decision was communicated to all team members through secure radio channels, and the carefully rehearsed plan began to unfold with the precision of a military operation. The entry team approached the study doors with equipment designed to minimize noise and structural damage while ensuring rapid access. The psychological specialists positioned themselves to provide immediate visual and verbal reassurance to William once the doors were opened. Dr. Mitchell prepared emergency sedatives and other medical interventions that might be necessary depending on William's physical and mental condition. The actual breach of the doors took less than 30 seconds, accomplished through the use of specialized hydraulic tools that allowed the heavy oak barriers to be opened without splintering or excessive noise. However, the psychological impact of this action on William was immediate and severe. The sound of the entry triggered what appeared to be a complete psychological collapse, with screaming and what witnesses later described as the most heartbreaking sounds of anguish they had ever heard from another human being. The scene that greeted the intervention team inside the study was shocking even to experienced professionals. William appeared to have lost significant weight during his isolation. His clothes were disheveled, and his appearance suggested that he had not slept or attended to personal hygiene for the entire duration of his confinement. The study itself showed signs of agitated behavior. Furniture had been moved into barrier formations. Papers were scattered everywhere, and there were holes in the walls where William appeared to have struck them with his fists. Most concerning was William's immediate reaction to the entry. Rather than showing relief at the end of his isolation, he retreated to a corner of the room and assumed a defensive posture that suggested he perceived the rescue team as a threat. His eyes, which showed clear signs of exhaustion and dehydration, darted frantically between the faces of the people entering his sanctuary, unable to recognize them as friends and helpers rather than enemies. Dr. Mitchell immediately took charge of the medical assessment, approaching William slowly and speaking in the calm, reassuring tone she had learned were most effective with patients experiencing acute psychological distress. Her primary concerns were immediate dehydration, malnutrition, and the possibility that William's agitated state might lead to self-injury or aggressive behavior toward the people trying to help him. The psychiatric specialist, Dr. James Worthington, began what would be a careful process of psychological stabilization. His experience with stress-induced psychosis in high-profile patients had taught him that recovery from such episodes required patience, understanding, and a gradual reconstruction of the patient's ability to trust and process reality. The first step was ensuring William's physical safety and beginning the process of rehydration and nutritional support. Sir Clive, witnessing William's condition for the first time since their briefing the previous day, was visibly shaken by the transformation that had occurred. The confident, capable prince he had briefed on national security matters had been replaced by a traumatized individual who appeared to be suffering from severe psychological distress. The weight of responsibility for this outcome settled heavily on the principal private secretary, who understood that his briefing had triggered the crisis that had brought them to this point. The immediate aftermath of the forced entry into Prince William's study marked the beginning of what would become one of the most carefully managed medical and security operations in modern royal history. Dr. Mitchell's primary concern was stabilizing William's physical condition, which had deteriorated significantly during his 30-hour isolation. The combination of dehydration, sleep deprivation, and stress had created a medical emergency that required immediate intervention while maintaining the absolute secrecy necessary to protect both his personal dignity and national security interests. The medical team established a temporary treatment area within William's private quarters to avoid the security and privacy complications that would arise from moving him to a hospital. Portable medical equipment was brought in under the cover of routine palace maintenance activities, allowing Dr. Mitchell and her team to provide intensive care without alerting palace staff or the media to the crisis that was unfolding behind closed doors. William's initial resistance to medical treatment reflected the paranoid ideation that had developed during his psychological crisis. He viewed the four fluids and medications as potential threats, requiring Dr. Mitchell to use specialized techniques developed for treating patients with acute stress disorders. The process of convincing him to accept help involved slowly rebuilding his ability to trust, starting with simple demonstrations that the medical team meant him no harm. Dr. Worthington, the psychiatric specialist, began the delicate process of psychological rehabilitation while William received medical treatment. His approach involved validating William's concerns about the conspiracy he had learned about while gradually helping him distinguish between rational caution and irrational paranoia. This therapeutic process was complicated by the fact that the underlying threat that had triggered William's crisis was real and serious, making it impossible to simply dismiss his fears as unfounded. The security implications of William's condition required careful coordination between multiple government agencies. The classified information he possessed about the conspiracy remained time-sensitive, and decisions needed to be made about how to proceed with the investigation and response while he recovered from his psychological breakdown. Sir Clive worked with intelligence officials to develop contingency plans that could be implemented without William's direct involvement until his condition improved. Catherine was contacted in Manchester and informed that William was experiencing a health issue that required her immediate return to London. The explanation provided to her was carefully crafted to convey the seriousness of the situation without revealing details that could compromise security or cause unnecessary alarm. Her presence was considered essential for William's psychological recovery, as his isolation from family had been one of the factors contributing to his mental state. The children were left in Manchester with their royal protection officers, and trusted staff members, allowing Catherine to focus entirely on supporting William's recovery without the additional stress of managing family responsibilities. This decision was made after consultation with child psychologists who advised that young children should not be exposed to a parent in acute psychological distress until his condition had stabilized. Catherine's arrival at the palace late that evening marked a turning point in William's recovery. Her familiar presence and voice provided the psychological anchor that medical professionals had been trying to establish through clinical intervention. The sight of his wife, whom he knew beyond any doubt was trustworthy and loyal, began to penetrate the paranoid barriers that had isolated him from reality for over 30 hours. The reunion between William and Catherine was both heartbreaking and hopeful for those who witnessed it. William's relief at seeing someone he could trust completely was immediately apparent, but so was the depth of psychological trauma he had endured. Catherine's training in mental health advocacy and her natural empathy proved invaluable in providing the emotional support that clinical treatment alone could not deliver. Dr. Mitchell's medical assessment revealed that while William had suffered no permanent physical damage from his ordeal, the psychological impact would require ongoing treatment and careful monitoring. Acute stress reactions of the type he had experienced could recur if he was exposed to similar levels of overwhelming information or responsibility without proper support systems in place. This finding had significant implications for how he would be involved in future sensitive government matters. The conspiracy investigation that had triggered William's crisis continued under the direction of intelligence professionals, but with modified protocols that would prevent any single individual from bearing the full weight of such sensitive information alone. The psychological toll of the revelations had demonstrated the need for better support systems when briefing royal family members on matters of national security. Sir Clive took personal responsibility for the crisis that had developed, recognizing that his briefing approach had failed to account for the psychological impact of the information he was sharing. He worked with medical professionals and security experts to develop new protocols for conveying sensitive intelligence to royal family members in ways that would provide necessary information while protecting their mental health and operational effectiveness. The broader conspiracy that had been uncovered was successfully disrupted over the following weeks through coordinated intelligence operations that did not require William's direct involvement. The plotters were arrested, their communication networks dismantled, and their planned attacks on the monarchy neutralized without any public awareness that such a threat had existed. This success vindicated the intelligence work that had uncovered the plot while demonstrating that William's psychological sacrifice had not been in vain. William's recovery process involved gradual re-engagement with his royal duties under careful medical supervision. Dr. Worthington developed a therapeutic program that addressed both the specific trauma of his isolation and the broader challenges of serving in a high-responsibility role while maintaining psychological health. This treatment would influence how the royal family approached mental health support for years to come. The media was told that William had experienced a minor health issue that required rest and medical observation. This explanation, while not technically false, protected both his privacy and the security classifications that surrounded the real events. The British press, accustomed to respecting medical privacy for royal family members, accepted this explanation without excessive inquiry. The long-term implications of William's psychological crisis extended far beyond his personal recovery. The incident led to comprehensive reviews of how sensitive information was shared with royal family members, resulting in new protocols that balance security needs with psychological welfare. These changes would influence intelligence briefing procedures for future generations of royals who would inherit similar responsibilities. Catherine's role during William's recovery demonstrated the importance of family support systems in managing the unique stresses of royal life. Her understanding and patience during his most vulnerable period strengthened their relationship and provided a foundation for addressing future challenges together. The experience also deepened her own understanding of the psychological pressures that came with their public roles. The children were gradually reintegrated into the family as William's condition improved, with careful attention paid to ensuring they did not suffer any lasting impact from their father's temporary absence. Child psychologists worked with the family to develop age-appropriate explanations for what had occurred, protecting the children's sense of security while maintaining honesty appropriate to their developmental stages. Dr. Mitchell's final medical report, filed under the highest security classifications, documented the complete recovery of William's physical and mental health while providing recommendations for preventing similar crises in the future. Her work during the crisis led to her appointment as the royal family's primary mental health consultant, recognizing the specialized expertise required to support individuals in such unique and demanding roles. The forced entry into William's study remained one of the most closely guarded secrets in palace history, known only to the essential personnel who had been directly involved in the crisis response. The participants were bound by both Official Secrets Acts and personal loyalty to the royal family, ensuring that the details of William's vulnerable period would never become public knowledge. William himself emerged from the experience with a deeper understanding of both his own psychological limits and the importance of seeking support when facing overwhelming challenges. The crisis had taught him that strength sometimes meant acknowledging vulnerability and accepting help, lessons that would serve him well as he prepared for the ultimate responsibility of kingship. The conspiracy that had triggered the entire crisis was eventually relegated to classified archives, its successful disruption recorded only in highly secure intelligence files. The public never learned how close the monarchy had come to a potentially devastating attack, or how their future king had sacrificed his own mental health to help protect the institution he was born to serve. Years later, William would reflect on those 30 hours of isolation as among the most difficult but ultimately formative experiences of his life. The psychological ordeal had tested his resolve, challenged his assumptions, and ultimately strengthened his commitment to serving his country and protecting the constitutional monarchy that represented centuries of British history and tradition.